The last tenant to leave room 6 left everything behind. Not some things. Everything. Clothes still in the closet. Food still in the refrigerator. A half-finished cup of coffee on the nightstand that had gone cold, and then moldy, and then dry over the weeks nobody went in there. Her name was Patricia Wells. 34 years old. Paralegal. No history of mental illness. No substance abuse. No reason anyone could point to. She simply walked out of the Hargrove boarding house on East Jones Street in Savannah, Georgia at 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. Left the door open behind her. Got in her car. And drove to her sister's house in Augusta without stopping once. Without calling anyone. Without taking her phone. Her sister found her sitting on the front porch at 7 a.m. Still in her pajamas. Barefoot. Staring at nothing. When her sister asked what happened, Patricia said 4 words, and then did not speak again for 11 days. She said she was still there. Welcome to Haunted Stories. What I'm about to tell you has been sitting in historical archives, paranormal research files, and one extraordinary unpublished manuscript for over 60 years. It has never been made into a film. It has never been the subject of a documentary. It has been covered by exactly 3 researchers in that entire time, and all 3 of them stopped before they finished. The Hargrove house is still standing on East Jones Street. It is currently a private residence. The current owners know its history. They do not discuss it. But the room that was always cold, room 6, second floor, northeast corner, that room the current owners use for storage. They do not sleep in it. They have never slept in it. And when I asked the current owner why, she told me something that I have thought about every day since. She said, because when you're in that room you get the feeling that someone else is already using the bed. The Hargrove boarding house opened in 1951. It was run by a woman named Cecilia Hargrove. Widow. 53 years old when she bought the property. She had been married for 22 years to a man named Douglas Hargrove who had died of a heart attack in 1949, leaving her the house, a modest savings account, and a grief so total and so consuming that her neighbors in the years after described her as a woman who had stopped inhabiting her own life and was simply moving through the rooms of it. She converted the house to a boarding house because she needed income. She took in 7 tenants. She gave them rules. Quiet after 10. No guests after 8. Meals at 6 and 12. And one rule she stated at the beginning of every tenancy without explanation and without elaboration. Room 6 is not for guests. Nobody asked why. Boarding house landladies in Savannah in 1951 had their quirks and their rules, and you respected them or you found somewhere else to live. Nobody asked. Nobody went in room 6. And for the first 3 years everything was fine. Fine meaning ordinary. Fine meaning the quiet routines of 7 strangers sharing a house under the management of a grieving widow who cooked well and kept the place clean and sat in the front parlor every evening from 7 to 9 doing needlework and speaking to no one. The first tenant to notice something was a man I'll call Edward. Railroad worker. Practical man. Not given to imagination. He had the room directly across the hall from room 6, room 5. And he told the researcher who interviewed him in 1968 that the first thing he noticed was the cold. Not a draft. Not the cold of a room that hadn't been heated. A specific cold. The kind that comes from a source. The kind that has a center. He could feel it through the wall between his room and room 6. He put his hand flat against that wall one night in February 1953 and he said it was like pressing your palm against a block of ice. He knocked on the door of room 6. Nobody answered. He tried the handle. Locked. He told Cecilia Hargrove about the cold the next morning at breakfast. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Don't touch that wall again." And she served him his eggs and did not speak for the rest of the meal. The second thing happened in March 1953. A female tenant, I'll call her Ruth, was coming up the stairs at approximately 11 at night. She had been at a friend's house for dinner, and had come home later than usual. The upstairs hallway was dark. She was moving quietly so as not to wake the other tenants, and as she passed the door to room 6 she heard something that stopped her completely on the stairs. A voice. From inside room 6. A woman's voice. Low and steady. Not distressed. Not frightened. Just talking. The way a person talks when they are having a conversation. Ruth stood on the stairs and she listened, and she could not make out the words, but she could make out the rhythm of it. The specific rhythm of someone speaking in a room to someone else in the room. Call. And response. Question and answer. Back and forth. She stood there for what she estimated was 2 full minutes. Then she went to her room. She lay in the dark and she thought about what she'd heard. And she realized something that made her cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had heard 2 voices. One she recognized. It was Cecilia Hargrove. And one she did not. Lower. Slower. With a quality she spent a long time trying to describe to the researcher 15 years later. She said, it sounded the way an echo sounds. Like the same voice. But coming back from somewhere farther away than it should. 3 more tenants reported the voice over the following months. Always at night. Always from room 6. Always 2 voices, Cecilia's and the other one. Nobody confronted Cecilia directly. This was 1953 in Savannah. You did not confront your landlady. You did not involve yourself in her private business. You minded your own affairs and paid your rent on time, and if the landlady wanted to talk to herself in a locked room at midnight, that was entirely her concern. That is what they told themselves. That is what they almost believed. Until August of 1953, when a new tenant moved into room 4. His name, I'll call him Thomas. Younger than the others. 26 years old. Recently returned from Korea. Not sleeping well. He had the kind of insomnia that combat produces. The kind where you're never fully asleep and never fully awake, hovering in the space between where everything feels like a threat. On his 3rd night in the Hargrove house, Thomas was awake at 2 a.m., and he heard the voices from room 6, and unlike the other tenants, he did not lie in his bed and mind his business. He got up. He went into the hall. He stood outside the door to room 6. And he listened. He told the researcher something that none of the other tenants had reported. He said the second voice, the one that wasn't Cecilia, was saying a name. Over and over. The same name repeated in that low echoing way. Cecilia. 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 He said it did not sound like a person calling someone. It sounded like a person reminding someone. Like a correction. Like whatever was in that room was telling Cecilia Hargrove who she was. Over and over. In case she forgot. Thomas started asking questions. Carefully. The way a man trained in reconnaissance asks questions. Sideways, patient, gathering information without revealing what he's looking for. He asked the other tenants about room 6. He asked the neighbors about Cecilia. He asked at the local library about the Hargrove family. And over the course of ABO. 3 weeks he built a picture. Douglas Hargrove had not just been Cecilia's husband. He had been everything. The neighbors who remembered the marriage described it in terms that made Thomas uncomfortable. Not because it was unhappy, but because of how total it was. Cecilia had no friends that were not also Douglas's friends. No interests that were not also Douglas's interests. No opinions that Douglas had not either shared or shaped. She had been, one neighbor told Thomas with a kind of careful delicacy, entirely devoted. In a way that went past love into something else. Something that required Douglas's presence the way a room requires air. When Douglas died, Cecilia had not adjusted. That was the word the neighbors used. Adjusted. She had not adjusted to his absence. She had not, one of them said quietly, ever seemed to fully accept that he was gone. Thomas went back through the library records. He found the obituary for Douglas Hargrove. Died March 3, 1949. Heart failure. Age 58. Survived by his wife Cecilia. No children. And then Thomas found something that none of the other tenants had found because none of them had been looking. He found a notice in the Savannah Morning News from April 1949. 6 weeks after Douglas died. A notice placed by Cecilia Hargrove. In the personal column, it said, "Douglas, the house is ready for you. The room is kept. Come home when you can. All my love. C." Thomas sat in the library and read that notice 3 times. The room is kept. Room 6. She had kept room 6 for Douglas. For 4 years she had kept it locked and cold and full of something that answered her when she spoke to it at night. And Thomas, who had spent 14 months in Korea watching men die and watching what grief did to the people they left behind, Thomas understood then what he was living inside. Not a haunted house. Not in the way people mean when they say that. Something more specific than that. More human than that. He was living in a house where a woman had loved a man so completely that when he died she had simply refused to accept the terms of it. And something, in room 6, behind that locked door, in the cold that came through the walls, something had accepted her terms instead. He told the other tenants. Not all of them believed him. 2 of them moved out within the week, not because of the supernatural element, but because they were uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people leave. The ones who stayed had a conversation about what to do. They agreed that someone needed to see inside room 6. Thomas volunteered. He waited until a Sunday when Cecilia went to church. She went ever. Why Sunday, 9 to 11, never varied, and he went to her private rooms on the ground floor. He was not a man who did things like this. He spent 10 minutes standing outside her door before he opened it. Inside was a small sitting room, a bedroom, a kitchen. Neat. Spare. The sitting room had 2 chairs positioned facing each other across a small table. One chair had a depression in the cushion consistent with regular use. The other chair looked like it had never been sat in. But there was a glass on the table in front of it, half full of water. Thomas stood in that room for a long time. Then he found what he was looking for. On a hook by Cecilia's bedroom door. A key. He took it upstairs. He stood outside room 6. He put the key in the lock. He turned it. And he opened the door to room 6 for the first time since 1951. The cold hit him like a wall. Not a drift of cold air. A wall. Solid and specific and so intense that he could see his breath in the August heat of a Savannah summer. He stood in the doorway and waited for his eyes to adjust. The room was furnished. A bed. A dresser. A wardrobe. A nightstand with a lamp. Everything clean. Everything maintained. Cecilia had been in this room regularly, dusting, straightening, keeping it exactly as it had been. For whom? The bed was made with military precision. And on the pillow, an indentation. The specific oval indentation of a human head. In a bed that had not been slept in. In a room that had been locked. That no one had entered. Thomas stood in the doorway of room 6 and looked at the indentation in the pillow and felt something he had not felt since Korea. The specific feeling of being in a space that belongs to something else. The feeling of trespass. He locked the door. He went back downstairs. He replaced the key. He sat in the parlor and waited for Cecilia to come home from church. When she came in, he was sitting in the chair facing the door. And she saw his face and she knew. She sat down across from him. And she said, "You went in." He said yes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something Thomas told the researcher he had never forgotten. She said, "He was angry when I got home last night. I could tell. The glass was on the wrong side of the table. He moves it when he's angry. He's been doing it since we were married." Thomas said, "Mrs. Hargrove, your husband is dead." She looked at him with an expression he described as, "And I want to get this right because he spent a long time finding the words," the expression of a person who has been told something they already know and have already decided does not apply to them. She said, "I know what Douglas is." "What age?" "He is now is not the same as gone." Thomas left the Hargrove house the following week. He has said in the interview that he felt guilty about leaving. That he felt he was leaving the other tenants in something he did not know how to name. But he left. He was 26 years old, and he had already seen enough things he couldn't name in Korea, and he had run out of room for more. The researcher who documented this case, I'll call him Dr. Harmon, came to the Hargrove house for the first time in 1961. Cecilia was still running the boarding house, still taking tenants. Room 6 was still locked. Dr. Harmon spent 3 weeks in the house posing as a tenant. He documented everything. The cold. The voices at night. The glass that moved. The indentation in the pillow that was always fresh each morning. And something none of the previous tenants had documented because it had gotten worse in the 8 years since Thomas left. The shape. Dr. Harmon was awake at 3 a.m. on his 9th night in the house when he saw it. In the hallway. Outside room 6. A shape. He described it as approximately the height and build of a large man. Not solid. Not transparent in the movie sense. More like, he struggled for the word, more like an impression. The way heat creates a shape above a road in summer. A distortion? A place where the air was wrong. He watched it for approximately 30 seconds. Then it moved. Not walked. Moved. From the hallway. Through the locked door of room 6. Through it. And was gone. Dr. Harmon sat with his back against the wall across from room 6 for the rest of that night, and he documented every minute of it in his notebook, and in the morning he went downstairs and sat across from Cecilia Hargrove at breakfast, and he told her what he had seen. She poured his coffee. She said, "He walks at night. He always did. Restless sleeper. I used to hear him in the hallway." She said it the way a wife says something about a living husband. Present tense. Easy. Fond. Dr. Harmon said, "Mrs. Hargrove, how long has this been happening?" She looked at him, and she smiled. A real smile. Warm. The smile of someone talking about something they love. She said, "Since the night he died. He came back that same night. I was sitting in the parlor, and I felt him. The way you feel someone you love when they come into a room. That specific feeling. Before you see them. Before they speak. That warmth. I felt it. And I knew he hadn't gone far." Dr. Harmon asked her if she was afraid. She looked genuinely puzzled by the question. She said, "Why would I be afraid of Douglas?" Dr. Harmon came back 3 more times over the next 6 years. He was building a case study. He was trying to understand what he was dealing with, not in supernatural terms but in psychological ones. What kind of grief produced this? What kind of love created something strong enough to hold a dead man in a locked room for over a decade? On his 4th visit in 1967 he arrived to find the house changed. Cecilia was 81 years old. She had stopped taking new tenants. Only 3 remained, and they had been there for years, and they had long since made their accommodation with what the house was. She was smaller. Slower. But her eyes when she talked about Douglas were the same. Lit up in a way that the rest of her face was not. Dr. Harmon sat with her in the parlor on his last evening there. And he asked her a question he had been building to for 6 years. He asked her, "Do you think he knows he's dead?" She was quiet for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere upstairs the cold of room 6 worked its way through the floorboards. Then she said, "I think he knows something is different. I think he knows this isn't the way it was. But I think..." She stopped. Started again. She said, "I think when you love someone enough you can give them somewhere to be. Even after. Even when they should be gone. If you hold the place for them carefully enough. If you keep the room right. If you keep the glass on the correct side of the table. They can stay." Dr. Harmon wrote in his notes that night. She did not summon this thing. She did not invite it through any ritual or practice. She simply refused to let go. And whatever was in room 6, whether it was Douglas Hargrove or something that had learned to be Douglas Hargrove from the shape of Cecilia's need, it had stayed. Because she had made a place for it. Because she had kept the room right. Because she had put the glass on the correct side of the table every single day for 18 years. and whatever the dead need to remain among us. She had provided it. Without knowing. Without intending. Simply by loving too much to stop. Cecilia Hargrove died in February 1971. In her bed. On the ground floor. In her sleep. The remaining tenants found her in the morning. The house passed through several owners over the following decades before its current occupants purchased it in 2003. The current owners knew none of the history when they bought it. They discovered it gradually. The cold in room 6. The glass that moved. The indentation in the pillow. They called a paranormal investigator in 2005 who spent 2 nights in the house and left after the first one. She told the owners what she had experienced. The cold. The shape in the hallway. The feeling of a presence in room 6 that was, she used this word specifically, domestic. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Domestic. Like something going about the routines of a life it had lived a very long time ago. The owners asked her what they should do. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told it she wasn't coming back. I told it she had been gone for a long time and she wasn't coming back and it needed to stop waiting." The journalist asked what happened. Patricia said, "It turned toward the window. Like it heard me. Like it understood. And then it just stood there. For a long time. Looking out the window. And I thought, and I know how this sounds, I thought it looked sad. I thought it looked like something that had just been told the worst news of its life. And I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I couldn't be in that room with that kind of grief. Because that's what it was. At the end of everything. Not a haunting. Not a demon. Not something evil. Just grief. A grief so large it had survived its owner. A grief so specific it still knew which side of the table the glass belonged on. A grief that had outlasted the person doing the grieving. And had nowhere left to go. This has been Haunted Stories. Subscribe if you dare.